Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. This time around, we've got Sharks forward William Eklund. Now, Eklund's story starts back at the 2021 NHL entry draft. The Sharks had the 7th overall pick, but it was expected that Eklund would go a couple of slots before that, perhaps even in the top 5. And so when Eklund's name was actually available at 7th, the Sharks were very quick in snatching him up. He would end up playing the start of the next season for San Jose, the classic 9-game look that you give to your young players. And while he would put up a few assists here or there, it was relatively clear that he was not yet ready to make the jump to that NHL game. And as such, the San Jose Sharks were forced with the decision of whether or not to send him back to the SHL or to keep him in North America and have him play with the San Jose Barracuda. And the Sharks ended up going with the controversial choice of sending him back to Sweden. And it's hard to say how much this may have hurt his development, but what we can say is that his game was not nearly as good as it was in his draft year. His point totals, or at least his point per game totals, suffered a decent bit, and his goal total suffered significantly with just a single goal over the amount of games that he ended up playing in the SHL that year. You usually want to see your young players sort of trend upwards in terms of their development. So the fact that William Eklund not only got an entire NHL training camp and preseason under his belt that year, but also played a good chunk of, or a decent chunk of regular season games with the San Jose Sharks, and then had a worse SHL year than his draft season, was not a very good look. Yes, he was on the worst SHL team, but still, and as such, expectations for William Eklund that were pretty sky high when he was originally drafted, many people felt as though he could be a number 1 winger on a team, now began to drop somewhat, and people were putting him more so in just a general top 6 camp for the San Jose Sharks into the future. Coming into the beginning of the 22-23 season, this time around, while he would again get his stint in the NHL and even managed to score his first career goal, it was once again deemed that he would not be ready to make the jump to the NHL, but instead of sending him back overseas, they kept him with the Barracuda, where he had a good amount of success, was one of the most productive forwards for the Barracuda that particular season, and in fact was one of the more productive rookie forwards in the AHL as a whole, and as such, many people felt he would finally make that transition to full-time NHLer next year, 23-24, which is exactly what he would end up doing. And Eklund was an effective player for the San Jose Sharks this season. There were multiple games this year where he was one of the best players for the San Jose Sharks. In fact, there were multiple games this season where he was by far the best player for the San Jose Sharks. But at the same time, he also fell into the classic pitfall that a lot of these young NHL players who are making that jump to the highest level do fall into. Once you get to game 40, game 50, game 60, the long, grueling schedule of the NHL where you're playing pretty much every other night with tons of travel, your level of play does begin to fall down. You don't have that classic experience to rely on with a lot of other veteran players where you can actually keep it up at a decent level of play. And so Eklund's consistency this season wasn't necessarily the best. I said he was at times the best player for the San Jose Sharks on the ice in some of their games, but at the same time, he was also one of the worst players for the San Jose Sharks in multiple different games, and as such, you'll see his grade actually drop somewhat slightly compared to the other top scorers for the San Jose Sharks, like Fabian Zetterlund and Mikael Granlund, for these very reasons. There were multiple stretches of time where William Eklund was just not particularly impressive, and even got demoted throughout the lineup. Never necessarily a healthy scratch, but still, for you look at Granlund and Zetterlund, who were always top 6 players, Eklund at times found himself on the 3rd or even the 4th line because of this lack of consistency. But still, when he was on his game, he was absolutely on his game and was one of the most skilled players for the San Jose Sharks. Taking a look at his statistics, 80 games played, 16 goals, 29 assists for 45 points. That is good for second on the team, just behind Mikael Granlund for that number 1 slot. Many of these points, I will say, did come on the power play. William Eklund had a ton of success on the power play, but still at even strength, he was quite effective. The statistic that stands out here in a bit of an ugly way will, of course, be his plus-minus. A minus 45 on the season is not only the worst on the entire San Jose Sharks team, but is actually the worst mark in the entire league itself. Right at the bottom is William Eklund standing alone at minus 45, and this doesn't look particularly good. Yes, this is of course the case where the Sharks were the worst team in the modern NHL history, but still, minus 45, the worst on the team, is not a great look. However, as we already know very heavily, while plus minus can be a useful stat, it is rather flawed. A player who just comes over the boards and factors not at all into the particular play on the ice could still be given a minus if the other team just so happens to score at the very moment he jumps over the boards. That's not particularly fair. And if you actually take a look at a bit of the deeper stats, possession numbers and expected goals numbers when it comes to William Eklund being on the ice, they're actually some of the better ones on the entire team. So while I won't completely forgive the minus 45 that he has, it is quite clear that he is not the worst defensive player. For instance, look at a player like Filip Zadina, who is just above William Eklund at minus 44 on the season, yet plays significantly less ice time and in significantly less tough situations. That's definitely one of those players who Eklund is a good bit better at defensively. On top of that, we can also look at the penalty killing situation, a situation that Eklund has played in at least a decent amount this past season, to show off how good he actually can be in the defensive zone. Because if you take a look shorthanded, there is no player who has been on the ice for less goals against on the opposing team's power plays than William Eklund on the entire Sharks roster. William Eklund is right there at the bottom for players who played at least a decent amount of time on the penalty kills. So basically, when Eklund is on the ice, the other team doesn't usually score too many power play goals. So again, defensively, when he's on, he can actually be an extremely effective forward. So I don't necessarily read too much into the minus 45 that he has here. In terms of time on ice, he was heavily relied on by David Quinn, 18 minutes and 40 seconds. This is only a few seconds behind Fabian Zetterlund and a couple of minutes behind Mikael Granlund, but still third on the team in terms of forward time on ice. So like I said, even just in a first full season at the NHL, David Quinn was clearly having no issue relying on William Eklund. There were even multiple games this season where he hit up to 20 plus minutes of time on ice and didn't look any worse for wear because of that. Now, going into next season, it's going to be very interesting to see how William Eklund's performances does change. This is the first full season under his belt. He's now used to, or at least has a taste of, the full season NHL grind. And it is quite clear, even before any potential free agent signings, that the San Jose Sharks offensively should be at least a bit of a better team next season, with the addition of Will Smith being signed out of college and the likely addition of Macklin Celebrini also being signed out of college, and the potentiality of certain young players also coming up into the lineup, like perhaps Thomas Bordeleau, who was already a mainstay near the end of last season, and perhaps someone like Daniel Gushin. It's likely that William Eklund will have a bit more help next season. Many people talking about the Lund line that the Sharks put up near the end of the season, but here's the case. Eklund's most time on ice at even strength was not spent with Zetterlund and Granlund, but was instead spent with Luke Kunin and Filip Zadina. So it just goes to show when Eklund was not on that top line, he wasn't necessarily playing with the best of players, so that could potentially have tanked his offensive stats, or almost certainly did tank his offensive stats. But with the Sharks likely looking a lot better in that particular area next season, he might have a bit more help, which could certainly help make his sophomore season even better than his rookie year. And in the end, though, when it comes to his grade on the season, like I said, slightly lower than both Granlund and Zetterlund due to a bit of a lack of consistency, but still a very solid B. Class dismissed.